Hello, and welcome to this session on strategies and planning for resilient cities, making disaster risk-informed decisions. I'm Sarah Wade-Apicella, Program Management Officer for the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction and our Global Education and Training Institute. Today we'll look at how disaster risk reduction strategies and planning support the roadmap to resilient development in countries and cities. I'll present disaster risk reduction trends and terminology and show what integrated risk governance looks like. I'll share some Making Cities Resilient tools and highlight opportunities for e-governance solutions to foster resilient and smart cities. We'll take a look at trends and terminology, systemic risk and integrated risk governance. We'll also look at global frameworks for global and local resilience action. We'll look at disaster risk reduction strategies for achieving resilience, cases and opportunities for e-governance, and then some smart city and resilient city standards from the ISO. First, to understand disaster risk, it's useful to take a look at disaster trends and terminology. What you see on the slide is a comparison of data on natural hazard reported disasters from 1980 to 1999 compared to 2000 to 2019. What you see is a marked and sharp increase, particularly due to climate change. These reported disasters and the total deaths and total number of persons affected and economic losses are only related to those natural hazards, not technological hazards or human-induced hazards. But what they show is a marked increase in those hazards related to climate change. In this slide, you see in particular the sharp increase of floods and storms, also drought and wildfire. These are those hazards most closely linked to the changing climate. With current projections, and the nationally determined commitments to reducing greenhouse gases and taking adaptation measures, what we see is that we're on a trajectory to a 3 Celsius increase. This will only result in additional and increased disaster trends. Now we have also new hazards. The impact of COVID-19 is likely to cause the first increase in global poverty since 1998, when the Asian financial crisis hit. And in 2020, COVID-19 is threatening cities and communities, endangering not only public health, but also the economy and the very fabric of our society. No one has been untouched. The World Bank is estimating that it's going to push between 40 and 60 million into extreme poverty. And many of these new poor will be people living in cities who are self-employed, mostly working in the informal sector. So indeed, cities and communities are really at the front line of coping with this pandemic and its lasting impacts. So what is important to understand about risk is the context of hazard, exposure, and vulnerability. It's often a misnomer saying natural disasters. In fact, there are no natural disasters. There is risk, there's hazard, either a natural hazard, a human-induced hazard, a technological hazard. There's exposure to that hazard. And then there is the vulnerability, the people living in unsafe buildings or crowded communities and cities. So really, reducing disaster risk is about the choices that we make, where we choose to live, where we choose to build, and what research we do as well. Death, loss, and damage is actually a function of this context of the hazard, exposure, and vulnerability. There's no such thing as a natural disaster, only natural, human-induced, technological, biological, and other hazards. So what does this mean? It means we're in a place that needs to take a large shift, a paradigmatic shift from where we currently are on this kind of disruptive path, where we've had a focus on disaster management with some emphasis on risk prevention, but not yet enough. In order for our systems to become risk-informed, we need to move towards a holistic, integrated risk management. We need to move to a disaster risk management paradigm where we can learn to live with uncertainty, provide preventive and mitigation efforts so that we can eventually also reduce the necessity for a response. So let's look at some disaster risk governance terminology. What does it mean? The risk governance landscape is a system of institutions, mechanisms, policy, legal frameworks, and other arrangements to guide, coordinate, and oversee disaster risk reduction efforts related to areas of policy. Good governance needs to be transparent, inclusive, collective, and efficient in order to reduce existing risks and avoid creating new ones. It really requires all sectors, all stakeholders in a coordinated effort. Now, you are concerned with e-governance and e-government. So how can that support? Well, e-government, according to the Public Administration site of the United Nations, looks at employing means for online government services to exchange information and services electronically with citizens, businesses, and other arms of government. Traditionally, e-government has been considered as the use of ICTs for improving efficiency of government agencies and providing governance services. But later, this framework was broadened to include the use of ICT by government for conducting a wide range of interactions with citizens and businesses. So in the context of disaster risk governance, e-government and e-government service and the use of ICT is critical. These are systems and an approach that can really help us understand risk and take those preventive actions. So disaster risk governance and e-governance can support our journey towards resilience. But what do we mean by resilience? If you take a look at the image below, you see a roly-poly toy, one of these toys that you knock but it can't stay down, it just bounces back up. This is an imagery that can recall a system, a community, or a society that might be exposed to a hazard. It can resist, absorb, accommodate, and adapt to those shocks. Over time, it can transform and recover from the effects of a hazard in a timely and an efficient manner, including through the preservation and restoration of its essential basic structures and functions through risk management. So resilience in the context of cities is this ability to withstand and bounce back from any acute shocks, natural or man-made hazards, such as those floods, earthquakes, hurricanes, wildfires, chemical spills, power outages, and other chronic stresses over a long period of time. It's important to understand these concepts so we know that we're looking at the whole of the system to understand how it's integrated and how together we can plan to bounce back from a shock. So let's move on to systemic risk and integrated risk governance. What does it actually look like? So first, it's important to understand that a city itself is made up of different systems. A city is a system of systems, if you will. A system of food storage and delivery, a system of energy and fuel, a system of water and waste, a system of protective infrastructure, a system of transportation, public safety, and numerous social systems. It's also made up of the healthcare system, ecosystem services, and the communities. So these systems have multiple connections and interactions, and because each system will have different owners and stakeholders, resilience must be a multi-organizational endeavor. So what makes the fictional city of Dreka Sustav resilient? Integrated risk governance. In fact, integrated risk governance and e-governance systems are part of what power this resilient city. This city has integrated its approaches and planning to include multi-stakeholder and all sectors in planning. They have addressed early warning to reduce risks and alert the communities of pending hazards. They have embedded water supply systems that are diversified, using, for example, recycled water. They have fortified the food supply system, looking, for example, at urban agriculture. They've diversified the energy system, using solar power and looking at small hydroelectric dams. They've looked at the health, housing, and well-being. They've looked at resilient infrastructure, and they have planned together. This type of city is ripe for participation. And the relationship between e-governance and the resilient city comes largely in this center spot that you see on the figure 5.1. E-participation can support decision-making, consultations, and citizen participation. On the right side, you see opportunities for public service delivery. This can include crowdsourced disaster maps, for example, or co-creation in new and resilient systems. In the policy-making sphere, e-governance can help by supporting the participation of all sectors and stakeholders in forums, in drafting policy, and ensuring that citizens' views and their needs are taken into account. Now let's look at global frameworks and how they can guide local action. Risk-informed sustainable development does require coherent action. It requires disaster risk reduction strategies and plans. It requires the use of climate data and action. It requires sustainable urban development planning and risk-informed financing. On the right-hand image in the screen, you see several global frameworks that guide these policy and action. Together, they require multi-sectoral and multi-stakeholder engagement and should be inclusive and take an all-of-society approach. This means engaging and consulting with citizens and communities. It means engaging with private sector and the business communities, and it requires the engagement of research and academia. Together, they can look and address a multi-hazard approach to resilience. Now, the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction is one of these global frameworks. It sets 7 global targets with shared indicators of SDG 1 on no poverty, SDG 11 on resilient cities, and SDG 13 on climate action. There are also interlinkages with 12 of total 17 SDGs. And Target E calls critically for both national and local disaster risk reduction strategies by 2020. These strategies underpin the development planning for a risk-informed and resilient city. The Sendai Framework has a 3-part goal. It aims to prevent the creation of new risk, reduce existing risk, and invest in resilience. It has 4 main priorities for action. It calls for an understanding of disaster risk. It calls for strengthening the risk governance to manage disaster risk. It calls for investing in risk reduction for resilience through public and private investment. It calls also to continue to enhance disaster preparedness for effective response with an aim to build back better. So similar to our resilience concept, this is about being able to bounce not only back, but to bounce back better based on an understanding of risk in recovery, rehabilitation, and reconstruction. Now, on the screen, you see 10 essentials for making cities resilient. This is a list of 10 essentials that targets local governments and the way local governments are organized to operationalize the Sendai Framework at local level. It has operational essentials, looking at organizing for resilience, identifying and understanding the use of risk scenarios. It includes strengthening financial capabilities for resilience. It also looks at resilient urban development and design, safeguarding natural buffers, and enhancing protective functions offered through natural capital. It looks at strengthening both institutional capacity and understanding and strengthening societal capacity. It looks at increasing infrastructure resilience and, in the event of a disaster, ensuring effective disaster response and recovery to build back better. So these 10 essentials give guidance on city planning for resilience. So what are the characteristics of a disaster-resilient country and city? There's a strong leadership and coordination, and responsibilities in disaster risk management are clearly delineated. In other words, we know who's doing what and who is responsible for what. The city has up-to-date knowledge about hazards and is able to use that knowledge. There is an adequate financial plan that complements and promotes mechanisms to support resilience activities. Urban planning is done based on up-to-date risk information, and it includes an understanding of who is most at risk. It includes understanding disaggregated data based on gender, disability, or age. Natural ecosystems have been identified, are protected, and monitored. And the institutions are strengthened to have the capabilities that they need to execute their roles. The social connectedness and the culture of mutual help are strengthened through community, education, and multimedia channels of communication. There's a strategy in place to protect and update and maintain critical infrastructure and serving continuity of services to reduce disruptions. It includes effective disaster response by creating and regularly updating preparedness plans. These should be connected with early warning systems and increasing emergency and management capacities. Post-disaster, recovery, rehabilitation, and reconstruction strategies are aligned with long-term planning, and they're based on that understanding of risk so that they can improve the environment after a disaster event. The UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction and the Making Cities Resilient 2030 initiative, together with partners, provide several tools that can help cities understand their levels of preparedness and their levels of capacity for planning for disaster risk reduction. The Disaster Resilience Scorecard for cities helps cities understand the status of their resilience building and identifies priority areas and actions for risk reduction. The scorecard elaborates indicators by each of the 10 essentials and is intended to be undertaken in dialogue through multi-stakeholder consultation. So for example, a city government can convene representatives for planning across all of the different city departments. Through dialogue on the indicators, they can identify those areas where they may have gaps and prioritize those to address in their planning. We also offer a public health system resilience addendum. This can be used together with the scorecard, and it aims at strengthening and integrating coverage of public health aspects and consequences of disasters. There are a series of questions that can also help you understand where the health system needs to be strengthened. A quick risk estimation tool also helps to identify current risks and potential future threats. So if you don't have a complete risk assessment, you can use this quick risk estimation tool to understand what are the main risks and hazards. Moving towards becoming a disaster resilient city requires planning. And as you can see on the slide, it's a cycle. Organizing and preparing for disaster risk reduction is an opportunity to raise awareness, plan the process, and convene the multi-sectoral actors, diverse stakeholders, for understanding what are the risks and what are potential actions. The disaster risk and resilience assessment can be conducted using the Scorecard tools, quick risk estimation tool, or other existing risk assessments. Here you can identify vulnerabilities, risks, assess the gaps, and the possible actions in order to respond to those risks. Then moving to developing strategies and action plans. Here, you can prioritize those interventions that are most needed. You can establish the roles and responsibilities, the timeframes, and indicators of what success would look like. This is a good opportunity to gain political buy-in, identify funding options, and then implement the strategy. Here, you can mobilize resources, implement disaster risk reduction actions, and ensure ownership and participation. As part of the continuous cycle is monitoring and evaluation and follow-up. Using your indicators and ensuring that those responsible remain involved, they can review the achievements, document lessons learned, and identify new areas for action, thus raising awareness of the successes and progress, and also where action still needs to be taken, and the cycle continues. So developing a disaster risk reduction strategy is a planning tool developed with a long-term perspective. It provides common vision, gives the guiding principles, and the priority areas for action. It should incorporate a certain amount of flexibility in its periodic evaluation mechanisms to adjust course when needed. Strategies are typically 5, sometimes 10-year plans, but they can be adjusted through the M&E cycle. The action plan provides the operational orientation for implementing the strategy. It defines specific goals to reduce risk in priority action areas, and it tells what are the roles and responsibilities required. What kind of resources need to exist? Is there an allocated budget, or do you need to raise funds? It contains timelines, indicators, and mechanisms for monitoring progress. The action plan is often part of the disaster risk reduction strategy, but can also be in complement. The words into action guidance shown gives suggestions and recommendations on how to approach the development of the strategy and action plan. So what are some of the cases and opportunities for e-government? If we go back to the Sendai Framework and we consider its means of implementation, it aims to promote the use and expansion of thematic platforms for cooperation, including global technology pools and global systems to show know-how, innovation, and research, and ensure that access to technology and information on disaster risk reduction is achieved. E-governance systems and e-government partners are uniquely positioned to help support this. Among the 4 priorities of the Sendai Framework, the Understanding Disaster Risk priority that addresses policy and practices based on an understanding of risk in all of its dimensions suggests that to promote real-time access to reliable data, make use of space and in situ information, including geographical information systems, and using information and communication technologies will enhance an understanding of risk. Now let's look at some cases and opportunities for e-governance that really illustrate the 10 essentials and the Sendai Framework. River level and flood map allow citizens to take greater control of their personal safety with early warning and forecasting apps like those on the screen. Open data platforms allow citizens and decision makers to access hazard, exposure, and vulnerability information for planning and decision making. Other opportunities for e-government are to link with national indicators that countries have a policy to utilize information produced by the public. On the screen, you see applications that crowdsource material and allow for real-time citizen engagement by reporting risks and hazards. Some examples of local e-government applications in response to COVID-19 have included putting in place new tools such as the dedicated COVID-19 information portals, hackathons, e-services for supply of medical goods, virtual medical appointments, self-diagnosis, and applications for e-permits. Many countries were quick to deploy tracking and tracing applications. Further opportunities for e-governance include increasing access to hazard knowledge, made possible through data collection from Earth systems and societal systems, access to open data in research and innovation, the use of open source software, and increasing and enhancing interoperability to ensure compatible formats and the ability to enhance access and use of risk information in loss accounting and risk-informed planning. Finally, data science is an area that brings together a growing requirement to be able to find the right information at the right time. Data science is an area that really needs attention under e-governance. Finally, another opportunity for enhancing resilient cities is through the use of the new ISO standards for cities. WCCD ISO 37120 certifies cities using their data to drive smart city development. It provides city-to-city learning, encourages city solutions globally, and fosters smart city innovation. ISO 37120 certified cities can become early adopters of 2 additional demand-driven data standards, 37122 on indicators for smart cities and 37123 on indicators for resilient cities, providing standardized data, knowledge, analytics, and innovation. Thank you for joining me for this lecture on digital government and smart cities for resilience, where we've understood that disaster risk reduction is indeed a core part of sustainable development and how e-government can help support risk-informed sustainable development through disaster risk reduction planning. I hope that you will find these Making Cities Resilient tools for disaster risk reduction strategies and action planning of use, and that you will be inspired to develop e-governance solutions for risk-informed development. Thank you.